The wind across the Nebraska plains doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like a judgment, a cold, steady whisper in the ears of the guilty. And 17-year-old Sutton Elise felt very, very guilty. She sat bolt upright in the back of her uncle's rattling wagon, her hands clenched so tight the knuckles shone bone-white against her skin. The wooden bench beneath her groaned with every rut in the road, a mournful sound that echoed the feeling in her chest. But she didn't move a muscle. She couldn't. The white travel dress she wore was pressed and perfect, a shroud for a life that was about to end. It wasn't for her, this dress. It was for him. The man waiting at the end of this long, dusty road in a town called Hollow Creek. A man twice her age. A man with more land than God and a grave in his yard where his first wife was buried. She hadn't even made it to her 24th birthday. Up front, her Uncle Aldous and Aunt Marlowe spoke in tight, clipped tones. They thought she couldn't hear over the rattle of the wheels, but she heard every single word. Aunt Marlowe was going on again about duty, about how a girl with no family and no dowry should feel grateful for any proposal, especially from a man like Cassian Blake. Gratitude was a cold, bitter thing in Sutton's throat. She'd met Cassian Blake exactly 3 times, and each time was worse than the last. The first time, he'd seemed polite enough, generous with his money, but his eyes were so empty she thought he might rattle if you shook him. The second time, he'd cornered her in the pantry, his breath smelling of whiskey and entitlement, and whispered what he expected from a wife. It wasn't love. It wasn't even companionship. It was service. And heirs. She'd said no. The first time she'd whispered it, and her aunt pretended not to hear. The second time she'd said it louder, and her uncle had slapped the word right out of her mouth before she could even finish the sentence. The third time, well, the third time wasn't a proposal at all. It was a meeting in a dim parlor where a contract was already drawn up, already signed by her uncle. Her life bartered for a few head of cattle and the cancellation of a debt she never knew existed. All that was left was the ceremony and the silence, the long, screaming silence expected of a bride who knew her place. "You'll live in a fine house," her aunt said, her voice sharp as it cut through the wind. She didn't even bother to turn around. "You'll have help, horses, respect. It's better than wasting away as a burden in our care." Sutton didn't answer. She couldn't trust her voice. But deep inside her, something cold and quiet that had been sleeping for years began to stir. It was a tiny, hard knot of defiance. The wagon rattled through the edge of town, past dying wheat fields and fence posts split by the relentless wind. Hollow Creek wasn't much of a town. It had a church, a dry goods store, and one doctor who smelled of cheap gin. But it also had Cassian Blake's ranch, a sprawling monster of a house with a red roof that looked like it had been painted with blood. As they crested the last hill, her uncle pointed. "There, that's your new life, girl." But Sutton wasn't looking. She was looking back, at the nothing she came from. Her parents gone in a barn fire 3 years ago. A fire that everyone called a tragic accident. But that always felt wrong. After that, she was just an unpaid bill, passed from one relative to the next until Uncle Aldous took her in. Now he was trying to balance his own books by selling her off. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the church. The sun hit the steeple, casting a long, thin shadow that sliced across the dirt path like a warning. A small crowd was gathered. Neighbors, townspeople, curious onlookers waiting to see the richest man in the county marry a girl who was practically a child. And there he was, Cassian Blake, standing near the steps, broad-shouldered, with iron gray hair and boots so clean they looked fake. His eyes locked on Sutton, and it wasn't a look of love. It was a look of ownership. He was looking at her like she was a new horse he just bought at auction. Uncle Aldous climbed down and walked around to the back of the wagon. He reached up a hand to help her down. "Time to go, Sutton." Sutton didn't move. "Take his hand," Aunt Marlowe hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. But the cold, quiet thing inside Sutton wasn't quiet anymore. It had caught fire. She lifted her chin, looked past her uncle, past the silent, watching crowd, and stared Cassian Blake right in his cold, dead eyes, and she said, "I can't." Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a razor. Then she said it again, louder this time. trembling but steady. I won't. The silence that followed wasn't just silence. It was a physical thing. It was heavy, thunderous, as if the whole world had just stopped breathing. Cassian Blake's polite smile froze on his face. The murmurs in the crowd died instantly. Every single eye in Hollow Creek was locked on the girl in the white dress, standing defiant in the back of a farm wagon. Her uncle just blinked, his face turning a shade of purple she'd never seen before. "What?" he said, his voice dangerously low. "Did you just say to me?" Sutton stood up. Her back was straight as a fence post, her voice shaking but full of a resolve she didn't know she possessed. "I said I won't marry him." "You'll embarrass this family," Aunt Marlowe screeched, her face contorted with rage. "After everything we have done for you." Cassian Blake took a single, deliberate step forward. His voice was smooth as poison. "Miss Elise, I'm a reasonable man. I can overlook this sudden lapse in judgment, if you'd care to reconsider, right now." It wasn't a question. It was a command, a final chance to fall in line, to be the good, obedient little thing everyone expected her to be. Sutton's chin lifted another inch. No. That one word, small and simple, struck the gathering like a bolt of lightning. Cassian's pale eyes narrowed. A muscle in his jaw began to twitch, a tiny sign of the fury boiling just beneath the surface. Her uncle, humiliated in front of the entire town, in front of the man he owed everything to, finally snapped. He turned on her like a rabid dog. "You ungrateful little fool," he roared. And then came the shove. It wasn't just a push. It was a violent, hateful explosion of rage. He slammed both hands into her shoulders, throwing all his weight behind it. Sutton stumbled backward, her world tilting sideways. Her boot heels caught on the edge of the wagon's wooden frame. For one horrifying, silent second, time seemed to stop. She was suspended between the wagon and the ground, her arms flailing at empty air. Then she fell. She hit the ground hard. The impact slammed the breath from her lungs and skinned her palms raw on the sharp gravel. A sharp, tearing sound echoed in the silent churchyard as her perfect white dress ripped at the shoulder and hip. The pristine fabric was instantly stained with dirt and blood. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone, a woman in the back, cried out, "My God, Aldous!" But her uncle didn't even flinch. He just climbed back onto the wagon seat, dusting his hands off as if he'd just finished a dirty chore. He looked down at her, crumpled in the dirt, his face a mask of cold fury. "You want to be so independent?" he barked, his voice carrying across the square. "Fine. Start by walking back home. And when you get there, don't expect to find a roof over your head." Aunt Marlowe said nothing. She just turned her face away, her expression stony, as if Sutton had already ceased to exist. The wagon wheels began to turn, slow and steady, pulling away from the church, leaving Sutton alone in the dust. Her hair was a mess, her skin was scraped, and her pride was bleeding out onto the ground. And nobody moved to help her. Not the preacher on the church steps, not the neighbor ladies clutching their shawls, not a single person. They just stared, frozen by fear or shock, afraid to defy the two most powerful men in their small world. But they were wrong. Someone did move. From the back of the silent crowd, a tall stranger emerged. He was broad-shouldered and weathered by the sun, with a long, loping stride that was pure cowboy. His coat was worn, but his boots were scuffed from miles of hard trail. He moved with a purpose that made the rest of the crowd seem like statues. He didn't hesitate. He walked right past Cassian Blake, ignoring the man's murderous glare, and knelt in the dirt beside Sutton. The moment their eyes met, Sutton felt something shift in the universe. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice soft and low, a stark contrast to the violence she'd just endured. She tried to speak but could only manage to shake her head. "Just dirty." He extended a hand. It wasn't a command like her uncle's. It wasn't a gesture of ownership like Cassian's. It was an offer, simple, respectful. She hesitated for only a single ragged breath before taking it. His grip was firm and warm. "I'm Stellan Rhodes," he said as he helped her to her feet, his strength easily steadying her trembling frame. "I run cattle west of the ridge. And that," he said, his eyes glancing back at the furious face of Cassian Blake, was the bravest thing I've seen in a long, long while. Sutton looked down at the hand still supporting her elbow. She was shaking, cold to the bone despite the afternoon sun. But she wasn't broken, not yet. I didn't have a plan, she admitted, her voice a raw whisper. A slow, warm smile spread across his face. It was the first genuine smile she'd seen all day. Well, lucky for you, he said, his voice dropping even lower. I'm not the type to let a woman walk away from cruelty on her own. And then, as the entire town of Hollow Creek watched in stunned silence, he did something no one could have possibly expected. He scooped her up into his arms. He didn't carry her like property. He didn't carry her like a scandal. He carried her like she was something precious, something worth protecting. And just like that, with the dirt on her face and the tear in her dress, Sutton Elise left the church. Not as a runaway bride, but as a woman being carried toward a future she couldn't even begin to imagine. But as he carried her away, she saw Cassian Blake's face. The rage was gone. It had been replaced by something far colder, something that looked terrifyingly like calculation. He wasn't just losing a bride, he was losing something else entirely, and he was going to get it back. They didn't speak much on the ride out of town. The wagon Stellan had borrowed from the livery was a simple thing: one horse, one bench, and a bed of hay in the back. Sutton sat there, wrapped in Stellan's spare coat, the rough wool a comforting weight against her bruised shoulders. She was trembling less from the cold now, and more from the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what she had just done. She had detonated her own life. She kept her eyes fixed on the horizon, watching Hollow Creek shrink in the distance until it was just a smudge of dust and regret. The farther they rode, the more space she felt opening up inside her chest. But every jolt of the wagon was a brutal reminder of her new reality. She was homeless, disgraced, disowned, utterly and completely alone, except for the silent man driving the wagon, a man she didn't know at all. Was this a rescue, or had she just traded one cage for another? Wasn't planning on rescuing anyone today, Stellan finally said, his voice cutting through the quiet. Just came into town for some feed and to check for mail. Sutton tried to smile, but her lip was split and it hurt to move her face. And now you've got a runaway girl in a torn dress with no last name. He glanced back at her over his shoulder, his eyes crinkling at the corners. You've got a name. You said it loud and clear in front of half the county. You said no. There was something in the way he said it, with a tone of deep respect, that made her sit up a little straighter. He wasn't seeing a foolish girl. He was seeing a fighter. They crossed over a high ridge just as the sun began to dip toward the west, bathing the entire landscape in a sea of liquid gold. And there, tucked into a protective grove of pine trees, was his cabin. It was small but sturdy, with a thin curl of smoke rising from a stone chimney. A little stream gurgled nearby, and the air smelled of pine needles, horses, and firewood. It smelled like peace. He pulled the wagon to a stop and tied the reins. Then, just as before, he walked around and offered her his hand. Always open, never grabbing. You can stay here for the night, he said, his voice gentle. Tomorrow we'll figure out the rest. Sutton stepped down slowly, every muscle in her body screaming in protest. But she didn't flinch when his hand brushed her waist to steady her. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, her feet touched ground that didn't feel like it was judging her. The cabin was even simpler on the inside. Polished wooden floors, a big stone hearth, and shelves overflowing with books and bundles of dried herbs. The bed in the corner was neatly made, covered with a thick quilt. He poured some water from a pitcher into a basin and set it on the table. There's stew on the stove if you're hungry, he said, gesturing with his chin, and there's some clothes on that hook over there. They should fit you well enough. My sister left them behind last winter. Sutton finally looked at him, really looked at him, searching his face for the angle, for the price. There was always a price. You're not worried, she asked, about what people will say? You, bringing me here? After all that? Stellan just shrugged, leaning against the doorframe. People talk. That's what they do. But I don't live my life for town gossip. I live for sunrises, good horses, and the knowledge that I sleep with a clean conscience at night. He paused, his gaze steady and direct. What your uncle did back there, what Blake was going to do, that ain't right. Sometimes a man's got to stand for what's right, even if he's standing alone. The sincerity in his voice was a physical blow. She wanted to cry, not from sadness or fear, but from the overwhelming shock of this simple, profound kindness. It was so foreign, it felt like a language she'd never heard before. When she finally found her voice, it came out as a broken whisper. I've never been looked at like a person before, just something to be managed, something to be married off. He pushed off the door frame and took a step closer. His shadow fell over her, but it wasn't threatening. It was protective. You're not something to be handled, he said, his voice low and firm. You're someone. And that was it. The dam broke. Silent tears streamed down her dirty cheeks. She didn't sob or make a sound. She just cried, letting go of years of grief and fear and loneliness. He didn't touch her. He just stood there, a silent guardian, giving her the space to finally fall apart. Later that night, after a bowl of thick, savory stew that warmed her from the inside out, Sutton lay beneath the heavy quilt in the small bed. Stellan had insisted she take it, unrolling a simple cot for himself near the crackling fire. Rain began to tap against the window panes, a soft, gentle rhythm, and the wind curled around the eaves of the cabin, singing a low, mournful song. But for the first time in her life, Sutton Elise didn't feel like a burden. She didn't feel like a problem to be solved. She felt like a beginning. She stared up at the dark wooden beams of the ceiling, listening to the steady sound of Stellan's breathing on the other side of the room, and felt a quiet space begin to bloom in her chest, where dread had lived for so many years. Tomorrow she would still be poor. She would still be an outcast. But something fundamental had shifted in the world. She had said no to the wrong life, and somehow, impossibly, a complete stranger had said yes to her, just as she was, broken dress, bruised soul and all. She didn't know it yet, but the events at the church were just the first tremor. The earthquake was still coming, because Cassian Blake hadn't been angry about a ruined wedding. He was panicked, and a panicked man with that much power doesn't just get even. He annihilates. And Stellan hadn't just been in town for feed and mail. He had been in town for her. He just hadn't known it yet. By sunrise, every porch rocker in Hollow Creek was creaking with gossip. The story had already twisted and warped into a dozen different versions. The Blake wedding hadn't happened. The orphan girl said no. Aldous Whitmore's ungrateful niece had run off with a drifter, a hired gun, a criminal. No one could agree on who Stellan Rhodes was, but they all agreed on one thing. Sutton Elise was ruined. Absolutely and irrevocably ruined. But Cassian Blake didn't deal in gossip. He dealt in power, and humiliation was something he did not tolerate. Men like him, men who had built their empires on fear and control, never did. He had money, he had land, and he had the town's loyalty bought and paid for. He was not used to being told no, especially not by a penniless girl who'd worn secondhand shoes to their first meeting. So he began to paint a new picture for the town. She's unstable, he told the preacher, his voice filled with false concern. Prone to hysterics, a danger to herself, really. She's a debt walker, her Uncle Aldous added, his voice loud and righteous in the general store. Always was unhinged, disobedient. Someone needs to bring her back before she does something foolish. The whispers started to change. Sutton wasn't a victim anymore. She was a madwoman, a thief, a problem that needed to be solved. And Cassian Blake was more than happy to offer the solution. He offered a bounty. It wasn't an official poster nailed to the sheriff's office. It was quieter than that, more dangerous, a whisper in the right ears, a handshake in a dark corner of the saloon. $50, a fortune to most folks in those parts. $50 to any man who found Sutton Elise and brought her back. Willing or not. Back at the cabin, the peace of the first night quickly evaporated. On the third day, a man in a dusty tan hat rode past the edge of Stellan's property, his horse moving slow, his eyes watchful. On the fourth day, another man left a single, deliberate boot print in the mud of the stream bed, not 20 yards from the horse trough. They were testing the boundaries, sizing him up. Stellan didn't say much about it, but Sutton noticed a change in him. The easy calm was still there, but it was layered over a new tension, a coiled readiness. The old rifle that had been leaning in a corner by the door wasn't leaning anymore. Now it rested in his hands when he sat on the porch at dusk, his gaze sweeping the tree line. "Are you afraid of them?" she asked him one evening, her hands busy folding a shirt she had washed and hung to dry. It was one of his. It was far too big for her, but it was clean and smelled of soap and wood smoke. He looked up from cleaning the rifle, his movements economical and sure. "No," he said, his voice flat. "I'm not afraid of them." He paused, sliding a freshly oiled rag down the barrel. "I'm afraid they'll think they can scare you." A small smile touched her lips. It was a strange and wonderful feeling. That smile came easier now. In the quiet, tense days since her escape, Sutton had changed. She had learned to milk the goat that lived in a small pen behind the cabin. She had learned to patch a split-rail fence and how to bake cornbread in a cast-iron skillet without burning the bottom. But she had also learned something far more important, something no one had ever bothered to teach her before. She learned that her voice mattered, that her choice had weight, that she was, in fact, a person. On the morning of the 7th day, it all came to a head. A boy came riding up the path to the cabin, his horse lathered in sweat, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. He was maybe 12 years old, breathless and panicked. "You'd best come to town, Mr. Rhodes," he gasped, sliding off his horse before it had even stopped. "They're calling a town meeting. The preacher, the mayor, Cassie and Blake. He's telling everyone Sutton's a runaway. Says she stole something from him, from his house before the wedding." Sutton, who had been feeding the chickens, froze. A lie. A blatant, vicious lie designed to turn her into a criminal. The boy twisted his hat in his hands. "There's talk of a trial." Stellan was on his feet in an instant, the rifle in his hand. His face was grim. "They're not taking you anywhere." But Sutton didn't flinch. She didn't cower. She straightened her shoulders, wiped her hands on her apron, and pulled on the sturdy boots Stellan had given her. The cold knot of defiance from the wagon had grown into a roaring fire. "Then let's go to town," she said, her voice clear and steady. "No one is dragging you into that hornet's nest," Stellan said, his tone gentle but firm. "Not unless they get through me first." She turned to face him, and for the first time, he saw not a frightened girl, but a woman made of iron. "They won't have to get through you," she replied, a strange, fierce light in her eyes. "I'm done hiding." She was walking into the lion's den, but what no one in Hollow Creek understood was that she wasn't the prey, not anymore. She was walking in with a secret her parents had died for, and she was about to use it to burn Cassie and Blake's whole world to the ground. As they rode towards Hollow Creek, Sutton felt a strange calm settle over her. The frantic fear that had been her constant companion for years was gone, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. Stellan rode beside her, his face set like stone, the rifle resting easy across his saddle. They didn't look like victims scurrying back to face judgment. They looked like warriors riding into battle. As they reached the edge of town, the silence was the first thing she noticed. People stopped what they were doing. Faces appeared in windows. The blacksmith's hammer fell silent. The entire town held its breath. They had expected her to be dragged back in disgrace, a crying, defeated girl. They did not expect to see her riding in, with her chin high and her eyes blazing. They tied their horses outside the general store, the same store where her uncle had declared her unhinged just days ago. The town square, which was really just a wide, dusty patch of road, was packed. It seemed every man, woman, and child had come out to witness the spectacle. Inside the meeting hall, which was just a large room attached to the mayor's office, the air was thick with tension. Cassie and Blake stood at the front, flanked by Uncle Aldous and two men wearing shiny deputy badges that Sutton had never seen before. They weren't local, they were Cassian's men. Her uncle saw her first, and his face went pale. "She's confused," he said quickly, his voice high and shaky. "She's been living with this drifter. She's not in her right mind." I've been living with a man who has shown me more kindness in 1 week than you have shown me in my entire life, Sutton said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like glass, silencing her uncle instantly. The mayor, a portly man with a sweaty brow, blinked at her. Miss Elise, do you understand the accusations being made against you? Mr. Blake claims you stole a valuable family heirloom, a silver locket. It's a lie, Sutton said, her voice ringing with clarity. Just like the lie that I consented to marry him. I didn't steal anything. I ran from a contract that was signed without my consent, my voice, or my care. She embarrassed this town, Cassian growled, his composure finally cracking. The mask of the concerned gentleman was gone, revealing the predator beneath. She refused an honorable proposal. Sutton took a step forward, directly challenging him. You didn't offer a proposal. You offered ownership, she shot back, her voice rising with power. You don't want a wife. You want a broodmare and a housekeeper. You want a ghost to replace the one you already put in the ground. A collective gasp swept through the room. No one had ever spoken about Cassian's first wife, Lily. Her death was a sad, tragic story that everyone just accepted. To bring it up now so brazenly was unthinkable. And then something incredible happened. Someone in the crowd clapped. It was a single, sharp sound that cracked the tense silence. Everyone turned. It was Blythe Arden, the town midwife, a woman whose hands had delivered half the people in that room. Her face was weathered and wrinkled, but her eyes were sharp and clear as they locked on Sutton with fierce approval. Then another woman stood up. Marlowe Jane, the widow who ran the dry goods store, and then another, and another. One by one, the women of Hollow Creek rose to their feet. They didn't shout, they didn't cheer, they just stood, a silent wall of support, their eyes fixed on the girl who was saying everything they had never dared to whisper. Every single one of them had been silenced at some point in their lives, and now, finally, one of them was roaring back. The mayor, caught between his loyalty to Cassian's money and the undeniable shift of power in the room, began to stammer. Well, there doesn't seem to be any formal proof of this theft. There are no grounds for holding Miss Elise against her will. Cassian's jaw twitched violently. You're just going to let her walk out of here? After this scandal? After the damage she has done to my name? Sutton took one more step, until she was standing just a few feet from him. Her voice dropped to a quiet, dangerous level. Your name isn't what's at stake here, Mr. Blake. Mine is. And for the first time in my life, I intend to keep it. She turned her back on him, a gesture of ultimate dismissal. Cassian, enraged and humiliated, lunged forward, but Stellan moved like a viper striking, stepping directly between them. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't make a threat. He just stood there, a solid, immovable object. You've got money, Blake, Stellan said, his voice low and calm, but carrying a deadly promise. But if you take one more step towards her, you're going to find out that a man's worth isn't measured in his cattle or his land. It's measured in how he treats someone who has less power than him. For a heart-stopping moment, the two men were locked in a standoff. The room was so quiet you could hear the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. Cassian's eyes darted around, looking for support, but the faces he saw, the mayor, the deputies, the men of the town, were full of doubt. The women had stood up, and in doing so, had given the men the courage to question. Cassian hesitated, and in that hesitation, he lost. He turned, his face a thunderous mask of fury, and stormed out of the meeting hall. Just like that. No explosion, no final confrontation, just a bitter, silent retreat. It was the end of something, the end of his unquestioned reign over Hollow Creek, and it was the beginning of something new. Sutton didn't cry. She didn't collapse in relief. She just let out a long, slow breath, a breath it felt like she had been holding for 17 years. She had walked into the lion's den and walked out with its teeth. But the real fight was far from over. This was a public humiliation. Cassian Blake wouldn't let that stand. And Sutton knew what he was really after wasn't his reputation. It was the small, folded piece of paper tucked deep inside her boot, the last page of his dead wife's diary. The page that hinted at a truth far darker than anyone in Hollow Creek could ever imagine. A truth that could get them all killed. The ride back to Stellan's cabin was different. The tension was gone, replaced by a strange, heady sense of disbelief and victory. Sutton felt lighter than she had in her entire life. She had faced down the monster and won. But Stellan was quiet, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. He knew this wasn't the end. It was just an escalation. "He won't let this go," Stellan said as they unsaddled the horses. "A man like Blake doesn't lose gracefully. He'll come back, and it won't be with lies and a town meeting next time." "I know," Sutton replied, her voice steady. She was no longer the frightened girl he'd pulled from the dust. "But he's afraid now. I saw it in his eyes. He's afraid of what I know." That night, by the warm glow of the fire, she finally told him everything. She told him about the barn fire that had killed her parents, how it happened just a week after Cassie and Blake had tried to buy their land. Land that had been in her mother's family for generations. Land that happened to share a border with Blake's sprawling ranch. Her parents had refused, politely but firmly. A week later they were dead, and the fire was ruled an accident. Then she pulled the worn leather boot from her foot. From a small slit in the inner lining, she carefully extracted a folded, yellowed piece of paper. "My mother gave this to me the day before the fire," she whispered, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded it. "She told me it was the most important thing she would ever give me, and that I should hide it and never speak of it." I was just a child. I didn't understand. It was a single page torn from a diary. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, but the words were filled with a frantic, creeping terror. "He is not who they think he is," the diary read. "The smiles are a mask. Behind them is a coldness that freezes my soul. Last night he flew into one of his rages over nothing, a misplaced ledger. His eyes, they went completely empty. He said things, terrible things. He spoke of how easily problems can be made to disappear, like the foreman who questioned his accounting last year, like the neighbor who refused to sell his pasture. He says no one will ever defy him. He keeps his secrets locked away, just like he locks me in this house. But I have found his hiding place. A loose stone in the back of the fireplace, in his private study. It is where he keeps his real ledgers, his real sins." The page wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. "Lily," Stellan breathed, his face pale in the firelight. "This is Lily Blake's diary." He looked at Sutton, a storm of emotions in his eyes. "My sister, Elara, she was Lily's best friend. She never believed Lily's death was an accident. Lily was terrified of heights. Elara said she would never have gone near that balcony railing on her own. After the funeral, Elara confronted Blake. He threatened her, told her to leave town and never come back, or she'd end up in the ground next to her friend. That's why she left those clothes here. She fled in the middle of the night with nothing but the horse she was riding." Suddenly, all the pieces clicked into place. This wasn't just a series of random tragedies. It was a pattern. Cassian Blake didn't just take what he wanted. He eliminated anyone who stood in his way. The foreman, the neighbor, Sutton's parents, his own wife. Sutton's mother must have been given the diary page by Lily for safekeeping. Blake must have found out. The accidental barn fire was his way of getting it back, of silencing the last person who knew his secret. But he failed. And for 3 years he had no idea the proof of his crimes was hidden in the boot of a grieving orphan girl. When he arranged the marriage, Sutton realized, her voice a horrified whisper, it wasn't about me, or an heir. He must have suspected my parents passed something on to me. He wanted to marry me so he could control me, search my belongings and find this page. Her refusal at the church hadn't just been an embarrassment. It had been a catastrophe for him. She had slipped through his fingers, taking his darkest secret with her. The bounty, the accusation of theft. It was all a desperate attempt to get her back under his control. "The loose stone in the fireplace," Stellan said, his voice grim. "If his ledgers are there, they could prove everything. Fraud, extortion, maybe even murder." A floorboard creaked on the porch outside. Instantly, Stellan was on his feet, the rifle in his hands, moving with a silent grace that was startling. He blew out the lamp, plunging the cabin into near darkness, lit only by the dying embers in the hearth. He motioned for Sutton to get down, to move away from the single window. Another creak, then another. They weren't alone. Stellan peered through a tiny crack in the wooden shutter. His body went rigid. "It's Blake," he whispered, his voice tight with fury. "And he has at least 4 men with him. They're armed." Sutton's heart hammered against her ribs. The town meeting had been a feint. While they were celebrating their victory, Cassian had been gathering his private army. He wasn't going to rely on the town's flimsy laws anymore. He had come to finish what he started 3 years ago. He had come to burn the evidence, and everyone with it. A heavy fist hammered on the cabin door, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the terrifying silence. "Rhodes!" Cassian's voice boomed from the darkness, dripping with venomous rage. "I know you're in there, and I know you have something that belongs to me. Send out the girl in the paper, and I might just let you live to see the sunrise." It wasn't a negotiation. It was a death sentence. Sutton scrambled to the back of the cabin, her mind racing. They were trapped. 1 rifle against 5 or more men. The cabin was sturdy, but it wouldn't hold forever. They would break down the door, or worse, set the whole place on fire, just like they did to her parents' barn. She could see the flickering light of torches through the cracks in the walls. They were surrounding the cabin. "There's no way out," she whispered, her back pressed against the cold wall. Stellan didn't answer. He was moving, checking the door's heavy bar, glancing at the fireplace. His mind was working, looking for an angle, an advantage. He was a rancher, not a gunslinger, but there was a fierce, protective instinct in his eyes that was more dangerous than any hired gun. "He said he wants the girl in the paper," Stellan murmured, more to himself than to her. "He needs you alive, at least until he has that page." He looked over at her, his silhouette a dark, powerful shape against the dying fire. "We're not giving him either." Suddenly, a shotgun blast erupted from the darkness, splintering the wood of the door. Shards of pine flew into the room. Sutton screamed, covering her head. Another blast tore through the window, shattering the glass. They weren't waiting for an answer. They were coming in. "The fireplace!" Stellan yelled over the ringing in their ears. "The stones are wide. If we can knock one loose." It was a desperate, insane idea, but it was the only one they had. He grabbed a heavy iron poker from the hearth and began slamming it against the mortar of the large stones that made up the back of the fireplace. Sutton joined him, using a heavy cast iron skillet, her fear forgotten, replaced by a surge of pure primal adrenaline. They had to get out. Outside, the men were shouting, emboldened by the lack of return fire. They were using a log as a battering ram against the front door. The heavy wood groaned, the bar straining against its brackets. Crack. The top bracket splintered. "It's working!" Sutton cried as a small crack appeared in the mortar. A sliver of cold night air hit her face. They hammered at it with renewed fury, their knuckles raw, their muscles screaming. Crash! The front door burst open, ripped from its hinges. Torchlight flooded the cabin. 4 men spilled into the room, guns raised, their faces illuminated by the wild dancing flames. Cassian Blake stood behind them in the doorway, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. "It's over," he said, his voice cold and final. "Now, give me what's mine." But the room was empty. For a split second, Blake and his men stared in confusion at the smoldering fire, the shattered window, the empty space where their quarry should have been. Then one of them spotted it, a gaping black hole in the back of the fireplace, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Smoke was still curling from its edges. "They went out the back," one of the men yelled. "After them!" Blake's face contorted in a mask of pure rage. "Don't let them reach the trees!" Sutton and Stellan scrambled out of the fireplace, covered in soot and choking on smoke. They were in the small enclosed space behind the cabin, where Stellan kept his firewood stacked. The night was pitch black, and the rain had started again, a cold, miserable drizzle that instantly soaked them to the bone. The shouts from inside the cabin were close, too close. "The horses are in the corral," Stellan whispered, his voice urgent. "It's our only chance. Stay low and run when I tell you." He peered around the edge of the woodpile. 2 of Blake's men were already circling the cabin, their torches cutting huge, swinging arcs through the darkness. They were moving to cut off the path to the trees to the corral. They were being herded. Suddenly, a piercing whistle cut through the night. It was Stellan. His horse, a powerful buckskin named Dust Devil, reared up in the corral, its eyes wide with alarm. The other horses panicked, kicking and whinnying, creating a chaotic diversion. Now! Stellan yelled, grabbing Sutton's hand. They broke from the cover of the woodpile and sprinted across the muddy ground. The wet earth sucked at their boots, trying to drag them down. A torch swung in their direction, catching them in its light. "There they are!" a man shouted. A shot rang out. A bullet whizzed past Sutton's ear, so close she could feel its heat. She didn't scream. She didn't even flinch. She just ran harder, her lungs burning, Stellan's grip the only thing keeping her upright. They reached the corral fence, a flimsy barrier of split rails. Stellan vaulted over it in one smooth motion, then turned to help Sutton. Another shot kicked up a spray of mud right at her feet. She scrambled over the fence, tearing her dress again, not caring, adrenaline singing in her veins. Stellan was already working on the rope that held Dust Devil, his hands a blur of motion. He ripped open the gate, slapping the other horses on their rumps, sending them stampeding out into the darkness, a wave of panicked horseflesh. Blake's men shouted in confusion, trying to get out of the way of the thundering hooves. In that brief moment of chaos, Stellan threw Sutton onto Dust Devil's bare back, then swung up behind her, grabbing a fistful of mane. "Hold on!" he roared. He kicked the horse's flanks, and the powerful animal leaped forward, charging not towards the woods but straight back towards the cabin, straight towards Cassie and Blake. It was the last thing they would expect. Blake was standing in the ruined doorway, his face a mask of disbelief as the horse and its two riders thundered directly at him. He raised his pistol, trying to take aim, but Dust Devil was too fast, a blur of muscle and fury in the night. Stellan leaned low, and as they galloped past, he swung the heavy iron poker he was still clutching in his hand. The poker connected with the pistol in Blake's hand with a sickening crack of metal and bone. The gun flew from Blake's grasp, and he screamed in pain and shock, clutching his shattered hand. They were past him, past the cabin. They galloped into the darkness, the sounds of shouting and gunfire fading behind them. The cold rain lashed at Sutton's face, mingling with the hot tears of terror and triumph that were streaming down her cheeks. They had escaped. They were alive. But as they rode, Stellan's body suddenly went rigid behind her. He let out a sharp, choked gasp. "Stellan!" she cried out over the pounding of the horse's hooves. "Stellan, what is it?" He didn't answer. She felt something warm and wet begin to seep through her dress, spreading across her back. Blood. He had been hit. The wild elation of their escape vanished, replaced by a cold, sickening dread. Dust Devil, sensing the change in its rider, finally began to slow, its sides heaving. Stellan slumped forward, his weight heavy against her back. "Stellan, stay with me," she pleaded, her voice cracking with panic. They were in the middle of nowhere, miles from any town, with Cassie and Blake and his men hunting them in the darkness. And the only man who could protect her was bleeding out behind her. He managed to lift his head, his breathing shallow and ragged. "The creek," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "Follow the water. North. There's an old line shack. Hidden." His strength gave out. He slid from the horse's back, landing in a heap in the mud. Sutton screamed his name, jumping down beside him. The bullet had taken him high in the shoulder, and the blood was flowing freely. He was already pale in the faint moonlight, his eyes struggling to stay open. She was alone, truly alone this time, in the dark, in the wild, with a wounded man and killers on their trail. The 17-year-old girl who had trembled in the back of a wagon was gone. In her place was a survivor. She had to be. She ripped a long strip of fabric from the hem of her ruined dress and pressed it hard against the wound, trying to staunch the bleeding. "You are not going to die," she said, her voice a fierce, trembling command. "Do you hear me, Stellan Rhodes? You are not allowed to die." She looked up at the vast, dark expanse of the Nebraska plains. The wind that had once felt like judgment now whispered a different word. Survive. Somehow she got him back on the horse. It was a desperate, grunting struggle in the mud and darkness, fueled by sheer terror and a will she didn't know she possessed. She half dragged, half lifted his dead weight, talking to him the whole time, a constant stream of pleas and commands refusing to let him slip into unconsciousness. She climbed up behind him, her small frame straining to hold him upright in the saddle, and urged the exhausted horse forward. She found the creek, a silver ribbon in the moonlight, and turned north, just as he'd said. Every splash of the horse's hooves in the water sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. She imagined Blake's men fanning out, hunting them, their torches like malevolent fireflies in the distance. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Hours passed. The world was a blur of darkness, pain, and the rhythmic plodding of the horse. Stellan was fading. He was cold to the touch, his breathing a shallow rasp against her ear. She was about to lose hope when she saw it. Tucked into a thicket of overgrown cottonwoods, almost completely consumed by the landscape, was the dark shape of a small cabin, the line shack. It was little more than a hut, abandoned and decaying. The door hung on one hinge and the roof had a hole big enough to see the stars through. But it was shelter. It was a chance. Getting Stellan inside was the hardest thing she had ever done. He was a dead weight, and she was running on fumes. She managed to drag him onto the dusty floor, his head resting on her lap. The shack was empty except for some rotting sacks and the smell of damp earth. There was no medicine, no bandages, no fire. She had to get the bullet out. She knew that much from stories she'd heard. If it stayed in, the wound would fester, and he would die for sure. Panic clawed at her throat. How? With what? Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely function. She took a deep, shuddering breath. You are not something to be handled. You're someone. Stellan's words echoed in her mind. She forced the panic down, replacing it with a cold, methodical focus. She searched the shack, her fingers exploring every dark corner. Her hand brushed against something metal, a rusty box. Inside, she found a small, tarnished flask, a book of matches that were miraculously dry, and an old, rusted skinning knife. It wasn't much, but it would have to be enough. She built a pathetic, smoky fire with damp twigs in the dry pages of the book, praying the smoke wouldn't be seen. By its flickering light, she looked at the knife. It was dull and dirty. Using a piece of her dress and the last of the whiskey from the flask, she cleaned it as best she could. Then she held the blade in the flames until it glowed a dull red. She looked down at Stellan. His face was ashen. His eyes were closed. She put the last of the whiskey to his lips. He coughed but swallowed a little. This is going to hurt, Stellan, she whispered, her voice raw. I'm so sorry. She bit down on her own lip until she tasted blood, and then she started to cut. The next 2 days were a living nightmare, a blur of fever, pain, and blood. Sutton managed to dig the bullet out of Stellan's shoulder, a ragged piece of lead that she threw into the darkness with a cry of disgust. She cleaned the wound again and stitched it shut using a needle and thread she found in a small sewing kit her mother had insisted she always carry. The stitches were crude and ugly, but they held. Stellan's fever raged. He thrashed and mumbled, lost in a delirium, calling out names she didn't know. Elara, Lily, and her own, Sutton. He called her name like a prayer in the darkness. She never slept. She sat by his side, bathing his face with cool water from the creek, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips, and holding his hand, whispering to him, telling him stories about her childhood, about her parents, anything to keep him tethered to the world of the living. She guarded the door with the iron poker, her ears straining for any sound of pursuit. She was a feral, desperate creature, running on nothing but nerve, and a fierce, terrifying love for the man who had saved her. On the third morning, the fever broke. She was dozing, her head resting on the edge of the cot, when she felt a hand touch her hair. Her head snapped up. Stellan was looking at her. His eyes were clear. The fever was gone. Sutton, he rasped, his voice weak. Tears of pure relief streamed down her face. She couldn't speak. She just sobbed, clutching his hand. He looked around the squalid hut, then down at his shoulder, neatly bandaged with strips of her white dress. He saw the bloody knife on the floor, the empty flask. His eyes moved back to her face, to the dark circles under her eyes, the dirt on her cheeks, the fierce, exhausted strength in her gaze. You saved me, he whispered, his voice full of wonder. You saved me first, she whispered back. They were broken. They were hunted. They had nothing. But in that tiny ruined shack, they had found everything. But their moment of peace was shattered by the sound of a horse approaching. Not the frantic sound of pursuit, but a single horse moving at a steady walk. Sutton grabbed the poker, her heart leaping back into her throat. She moved to the broken door, peering through a crack. It wasn't Blake. It was a woman riding a sturdy-looking mare. It was Blythe Arden, the midwife. She dismounted and approached the shack cautiously. "Hello, Miss Elise? Are you in there?" Sutton opened the door, her eyes wide with suspicion. How had she found them? Blythe's weathered face broke into a look of immense relief. "Thank God, I was so worried." She looked past Sutton and saw Stellan, pale but conscious. "The boy, my grandson, he followed you that night, saw the whole thing. He came and got me as soon as Blake and his men rode back to town." She pushed a heavy saddlebag into Sutton's hands. It was filled with food, clean bandages, and salves. "The town is in an uproar," Blythe said, her voice low and urgent. "Blake told everyone that Rhodes kidnapped you, that he's a wanted criminal. He's got the whole county looking for you. He put a new bounty on Stellan's head, dead or alive." Sutton's blood ran cold. "But not everyone believes him," Blythe continued, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "The women, we remember Lily. We see the way he looks at you, and it's the same way he used to look at her. Like property. We've started talking, whispering. Marlo Jane, the store owner, she's with us. We're not going to let him do this again." Blythe reached into her pocket. "But that's not the only reason I'm here." She pulled out a small tarnished silver key. "Lily gave this to me a week before she died. She was terrified. She told me if anything ever happened to her, I was to give this to Alara Rhodes. But Alara was gone before I had the chance. Lily said it was the key to his undoing." Sutton looked at the key, then at the diary page she still had tucked away. The page mentioned a hiding place. It mentioned ledgers, but it didn't say what they were for. Blythe looked at Stellan. "Lily told me it opens a safe deposit box at the bank in Junction City. That's 2 days' ride from here. She said it contains proof. Proof of everything." This was it, the final piece. The key to destroying Cassie and Blake once and for all. But Junction City was 2 days away. Stellan was too weak to ride, and Cassie and Blake had the entire county hunting for them. It was an impossible choice. Flee and save themselves, or risk everything for a justice that was years overdue. Stellan, leaning against the doorframe, made the choice for them. "You have to go, Sutton," he said, his voice weak but firm. "You have to go for Lily, for your parents, for Alara." He looked at her, his eyes full of a trust that stole her breath. "You're the only one who can." Leaving Stellan felt like ripping out a part of her own soul. Blythe promised to stay with him, to tend to his wound and hide him until Sutton returned. The midwife gave Sutton her own horse, a fresh mount, along with a simple boy's outfit, trousers, a flannel shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat to hide her hair. As Sutton Elise, she was a target. As a nondescript boy riding east, she might just be invisible. "Ride hard and don't talk to anyone," Stellan whispered as she mounted the horse, his hand gripping hers tightly. "And Sutton, come back." "I will," she promised, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I will." The 2-day ride to Junction City was grueling. Sutton rode with a singular, burning focus, pushing the horse and herself to their limits. She avoided main roads, sticking to game trails and riverbeds, her eyes constantly scanning for any sign of pursuit. Every traveler she saw was a potential bounty hunter. Every distant plume of dust sent a jolt of fear through her. Junction City was bigger and louder than any place she had ever been. The sheer number of people was overwhelming. She kept her hat pulled low, her shoulders hunched, and made her way to the bank, a formidable brick building that looked like a fortress. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she walked inside. The air was cool and smelled of paper and money. She approached the teller, a stern-looking man with a neatly trimmed mustache, and slid the silver key onto the counter. Her hand was shaking. I need to access a safe deposit box," she said, her voice coming out as a squeak. She cleared her throat and tried again, pitching her voice lower. The name is Blake. The teller looked at her, then at the key, his expression unreadable. He disappeared into a back room for what felt like an eternity. Sutton's nerves were screaming. This was it. This was where she would be caught. The teller would recognize the name, raise the alarm, and Cassian's long reach would finally grab her. But the man returned with a large, heavy metal box and placed it on the counter. He used his own key, then motioned for Sutton to use hers. With a trembling hand, she inserted the silver key and turned. The lock clicked open. The teller, with a bored expression, turned and walked away, giving her privacy. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, there wasn't just one ledger. There were three, and tucked between them was a thick bundle of letters, tied with a black ribbon. She opened the top ledger. The handwriting was Cassian's, precise and cold. It wasn't a record of cattle sales. It was a meticulously detailed account of every bribe, every threat, every piece of blackmail he had ever used to build his empire. The foreman who disappeared. The neighbor whose farm mysteriously went bankrupt. It was all there, in cold, hard numbers. Then she opened the letters. They were from Lily. They were addressed to the sheriff of Junction City. They were a desperate, detailed plea for help, chronicling Cassian's abuse, his rages, and her growing fear for her life. The last letter was dated the day before she died. He knows I have found his ledgers, she had written. He cornered me in the study this morning. He told me that he is the law in Hollow Creek, and that if I ever try to expose him, he will silence me permanently. I am sending this with Blythe. If you do not hear from me again within a week, please, for the love of God, come for him. Don't let him get away with it. He had gotten away with it. The letters were never sent. Lily had died, and the sheriff in Junction City never knew a thing. But the most damning piece of evidence was at the very bottom of the box. It was a signed, witnessed deed, the deed to her parents' land. It was dated the day after the fire. The signature, supposedly her father's, was a crude, obvious forgery. And the witness who had signed it? The sheriff of Hollow Creek. This was it. The proof. The murder weapon, not of one crime, but of a lifetime of them. Sutton stuffed the ledgers and the letters into her saddlebag, her mind a whirlwind. She had to get back. She had to get this to someone who couldn't be bought. Someone outside of Cassian's sphere of influence. The sheriff in Junction City. She raced back out of the bank, nearly colliding with a man standing on the boardwalk. "Watch where you're going, boy," he snarled. Sutton froze. It was one of the men who had been at the cabin, one of Cassian's deputies. His eyes narrowed in suspicion, looking at her face, then at the saddlebag clutched in her hand. A slow, ugly smile of recognition spread across his face. Well, look what we have here." He lunged for her. Sutton didn't hesitate. She swung the heavy saddlebag with all her might, catching him square in the face. The weight of the ledgers sent him staggering backward with a cry of pain. She didn't wait to see what happened next. She untied her horse in a frantic panic and threw herself into the saddle, kicking the animal into a gallop. She flew down the main street of Junction City, weaving through wagons and pedestrians, the deputy's shouts ringing out behind her. "Stop her! Stop that thief!" People turned to stare, but no one moved to help. She reached the edge of town and didn't look back. She rode like the devil himself was on her heels. Because he was. They knew where she was. The hunt was on again, but this time it was a race against the clock. She had the proof, but it was worthless if she was dead. She pushed her horse for hours, her body screaming in protest, until she was deep in the wilderness again, her only guide the setting sun. She had to get off the main trail. She veered into the dense woods, letting the branches whip at her face, praying she could lose them. As dusk fell, she found a small hidden cave, barely big enough for her and the horse. She was exhausted, terrified, but triumphant. She had done it. She had the evidence that would bring Cassian Blake to his knees. But as she unsaddled her horse, she saw it, a dark, ugly brand on its flank, partially hidden by the saddle. It was the brand of the Hollow Creek livery stable. The horse Blythe had given her, it was from the town, a town Blake controlled. A cold dread washed over her. It wasn't a coincidence that the deputy had been waiting outside the bank. It was a trap. Blythe hadn't helped her. She had led her right into an ambush. The betrayal was a physical blow, more painful than any fall or gunshot. Blythe, the brave midwife who had clapped for her, who had stood with the women, had been working for Cassian all along. The story about her grandson, the key, the clothes, it was all an elaborate lie. A lie designed to get Sutton to lead them directly to the one thing that could destroy Cassian Blake forever. And she had fallen for it completely. She heard the sound of dogs barking in the distance. They were tracking her. The brand on the horse was probably a signal, a scent for them to follow. She was trapped. She scrambled to the mouth of the cave, peering into the twilight. She could see them, the distant, flickering lights of torches, weaving through the trees, getting closer and closer. This was the end of the line. There was no escape. They had her cornered. But as she looked down at the heavy ledgers in her hand, a new feeling rose up, drowning out the fear and the despair. Rage. They had taken her parents. They had taken Lily. They had almost taken Stellan. They would not take this. They would not win. If she was going down, she was taking Cassian Blake with her. She looked around the small cave. It was damp, earthy, and against the back wall, there was a pile of dry leaves and brush, probably an old animal nest. An idea sparked in her mind. A terrible, desperate, fiery idea. An idea born from a barn fire 3 years ago. She pulled out the matches. She had 2 left. Sutton worked with frantic, purposeful energy. She ripped the pages from the ledgers, the damning evidence of Cassian's crimes, and crumpled them into a pile with the dry brush. She kept only Lily's letters and the forged deed, tucking them deep inside her shirt. The rest would be her weapon. The barking was closer now, loud and savage. She could hear men's voices shouting. She lit the first match. It sputtered and died in the damp air. Her heart seized with panic. 1 match left. 1 chance. She shielded it with her body, striking it against the rough cave wall. It flared to life, a tiny, precious flame. She held it to the edge of a crumpled ledger page. The corner blackened, smoked, and then with a soft whoosh, it caught fire. She fed the flames page by page until a healthy bonfire was roaring in the small cave. The smoke was thick and acrid, burning her lungs, but she didn't care. The cave began to fill with a dense gray cloud. The only exit was the small entrance, and the smoke was pouring out of it like a signal. "In here! The smoke's coming from in here!" a voice shouted from just outside. Sutton grabbed a heavy branch from her fire, the end of it glowing red hot. She flattened herself against the cave wall, right beside the entrance, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The barking was deafening now. The first shape appeared in the entrance, silhouetted against the night sky. It was a large, vicious-looking hound, its teeth bared. Before it could even react, Sutton swung the fiery branch, striking the animal across the head. It yelped in pain and surprise, stumbling back. Then a man burst in, gun raised. It was the same deputy from the bank. His eyes widened in shock as he saw the fire. But before he could aim, Sutton was on him. She was a whirlwind of fury, shoving the burning end of the branch into his face. He screamed, dropping his gun and staggering back out of the cave, clutching his eyes. Another man tried to enter, but he was met with a wall of thick, choking smoke. He coughed and recoiled. "She's crazy!" the burned deputy screamed from outside. "The little witch set a fire." Sutton knew she had only moments. The fire was growing, consuming the oxygen in the small space. She had to get out, but not the way she came in. As the men outside hesitated, blinded by the smoke, she scrambled to the back of the cave. She had felt a draft earlier, a small fissure in the rock, hidden behind the brush pile that was now an inferno. She clawed at the rocks, her fingers bleeding, and managed to widen the opening just enough to squeeze through. She emerged on the other side of the rock formation, on a small ledge overlooking a steep drop. The sounds of the men and dogs were on the other side, confused by the fire and smoke. She had a head start, a small one. She scrambled down the rocky cliff, sliding and falling, not caring about the cuts and bruises. She had to get to her horse, but when she reached the spot where she'd left it, it was gone. Of course, they would have taken it. She was on foot, miles from anywhere. but she was free, and she still had the most important pieces of evidence clutched safely against her chest. She ran. She ran through the night, guided by the stars, fueled by a rage that burned hotter than any fire. She ran back towards Hollow Creek, back towards Stellan, back towards a final confrontation. But as the sun began to rise, painting the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. A single rider on the horizon, heading straight for her. She dove for cover, hiding in a shallow ditch, her heart in her throat. Was it one of them? Had they circled around her? The rider drew closer. It wasn't one of Cassian's men. The figure was smaller, slighter. As the light grew stronger, she recognized the horse. It was Blythe Arden's mare. But the rider wasn't Blythe. It was her grandson, the boy. He was scanning the landscape, a desperate look on his face. He cupped his hands around his mouth and called out her name. Sutton! Sutton Elise! Sutton took a chance. She stood up. The boy saw her and galloped over, his face a mixture of terror and relief. You have to run, he gasped, his eyes wide. Blake knows everything. He's on his way back to the line shack to finish off Mr. Rhodes. Grandma sent me to find you, to warn you. Sutton's blood ran cold. Your grandmother. She's the one who set me up. The boy's face crumpled in confusion. No, it wasn't her. When you left, Blake came to see her. He knew she was friends with Lily. He threatened me. He told her if she didn't send you to the bank in Junction City, where his men were waiting, he would hurt me. She had no choice. She was trying to buy you time. The betrayal she had felt vanished, replaced by a wave of understanding and pity. Blythe hadn't been a traitor. She had been a mother, forced to make an impossible choice. She told me to give you this, the boy said, handing her a small folded note. She said you'd know what to do. Sutton unfolded the paper. It was a hastily scrawled map of Hollow Creek. The midwife had marked several locations: the sheriff's office, the livery, and Cassian Blake's ranch. Next to the ranch, she had drawn a small symbol for dynamite. The symbol was right over the location of the main well. Underneath, Blythe had written a single sentence. He has men guarding the town, but they can't be everywhere at once. A loud noise will bring them all running. It was a plan. A desperate, crazy, brilliant plan. Create a diversion. While Blake was on his way to kill Stellan, and while his men were guarding the town, Sutton was to hit him where he lived. Draw his men away from the town center, giving her a clear path. A path to what? Sutton looked at the map again. One building was circled in red ink, the telegraph office. It all clicked into place. She wasn't supposed to run. She was supposed to fight back. Not with guns, but with the truth. She was going to tell the entire world what Cassian Blake had done. He's headed to the line shack now? Sutton asked, her voice grim. The boy nodded frantically. He left an hour ago. He only took 2 men with him. He thinks you're still miles away. Sutton looked towards the line shack, then back towards Hollow Creek. She had another impossible choice. Go back for Stellan and risk getting caught in Blake's trap, or ride for the town and risk Stellan's life for the chance to expose Blake for good. She made the choice in a heartbeat. Stellan had told her to go, to finish this, and she would, for both of them. Get back to your grandmother, she told the boy, her voice filled with a new authority. Tell her to be ready, and tell her thank you. She swung onto the back of his horse, took the reins, and turned not towards the safety of the wilderness, but back into the heart of the storm, back to Hollow Creek. She was going to burn his kingdom to the ground, not with fire, but with a few simple words sent crackling over a wire. The ride into Hollow Creek was eerily quiet. Just as Blythe had predicted, the town was being watched. Sutton saw 2 of Cassian's hired guns lurking near the main road, their rifles held casually, but their eyes were sharp. She circled around using the cover of the hills and came into town from the south, the way she had first arrived in that miserable wagon, what felt like a lifetime ago. She found the stash of dynamite exactly where Blythe's map indicated, hidden in an old barrel behind the blacksmith's shop. It was a terrifyingly heavy bundle with a short fuse. She galloped towards Blake's ranch, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. This had to work. From a ridge overlooking the sprawling ranch house, she could see 2 more guards patrolling the perimeter. She lit the fuse, the spark fizzing ominously. She counted to 3, then hurled the bundle with all her might towards the stone well house in the center of the property. She didn't wait to see it land. She spurred her horse and raced back towards the town, the sound of the explosion a deafening, earth-shattering roar behind her. The ground shook. A huge plume of water, rock, and dust shot into the sky. It was a much bigger explosion than she had anticipated. Shouts of alarm rose from the town. As she watched from her hiding place, she saw all 4 of Cassian's men abandon their posts, jumping on their horses and racing towards the ranch to see what had happened. The path was clear. She rode into the deserted town square, the horse's hooves echoing loudly in the sudden silence. She leaped off the horse and ran into the telegraph office. The telegraph operator, a mousy little man, looked up at her in terror. "You!" he squeaked, recognizing her. "Send a message," Sutton commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. She slammed Lily's letters and the forged deed onto his desk. "Now!" His eyes widened as he read the first few lines of Lily's desperate plea. He looked from the papers to Sutton's face, a face full of dirt, determination, and righteous fury. He was a man who had lived his whole life in fear of Cassian Blake. But in that moment, he saw something more powerful than fear. He saw the truth. He nodded once, his hands moving to the telegraph key. "Who are you sending it to?" he asked. "The U.S. Marshals in Omaha," Sutton said, her voice clear and strong, "and the editor of the Omaha Daily Herald. Send every word. Tell them to come to Hollow Creek. Tell them what Cassian Blake did to my parents. Tell them what he did to his wife." As the operator's fingers began to fly across the key, translating her words into frantic clicks and dashes, Sutton ran back outside. It was over. The message was sent. The truth was out, flying across the wires unstoppable. But she wasn't done. She had one more thing to do. She had a promise to keep. She got back on her horse and rode like the wind, back towards the line shack, back to Stellan. She didn't know if she would be in time. She didn't know if Cassian had already reached him. All she knew was that she couldn't leave him. The journey that had taken her a full night of terror now took less than an hour. As she approached the thicket of trees hiding the shack, she slowed, listening. She heard voices. A man's voice raised in anger. "Cassian Blake." "Where is it?" he was roaring. "Where did she go with my ledgers?" Sutton dismounted, creeping through the underbrush, her iron poker clutched in her hand. She peered through the leaves. Cassian and his 2 men were standing over Stellan, who was propped against the cabin wall. Blythe Arden was kneeling beside him, trying to shield him. Stellan's face was pale, but his eyes were defiant. "You're too late, Blake," Stellan coughed, a trickle of blood at the corner of his mouth. "You've already lost." Blake laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I've lost nothing. I'll find the girl, I'll get my property back, and then I'll bury all 3 of you out here where no one will ever find you." He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Stellan's head. "For the last time. Where is she?" "Right here," a voice said from behind him. Cassian Blake spun around. Sutton stood at the edge of the clearing, her face grim, the poker held like a weapon. His men turned, raising their rifles. Blake's face broke into a cruel, triumphant smile. "The little witch comes home to roost. Foolish girl. Did you really think you could win?" "It's already over, Cassian," she said, her voice ringing with confidence. "While you were out here playing games, I was in the telegraph office. I sent everything to the marshals. Lily's letters, the forged deed to my parents' land. The whole world knows what you are." His smile vanished. His face went white with shock and fury. For a second, he was speechless. He knew she was telling the truth. The diversion at the ranch, the empty town, it all made sense. He was ruined, but a cornered animal is the most dangerous. "Then we all die together," he screamed, his face contorted in a mask of madness. He swung his pistol back towards Stellan. But Blythe Arden moved first. With a cry of rage, the old midwife launched herself at Blake, clawing at his gun arm. One of his men lunged at Sutton, but Stellan, with a surge of adrenaline, kicked his feet out, tripping the man. He went down in a heap. Sutton charged forward, swinging the heavy iron poker. She brought it down hard on the wrist of the second gunman as he tried to take aim. Bones snapped, and he howled in agony, dropping his rifle. Blake threw Blythe to the ground and turned, his eyes wild, bringing his gun around to bear on Sutton. But he never got the chance. A single gunshot echoed through the clearing. Cassian Blake froze. A look of surprise crossed his face. A small red dot appeared on his chest. He looked down at it, confused, then crumpled to the ground. Sutton stared, stunned. Standing behind the body, holding a smoking rifle, was her uncle Aldous. His face was pale, his hands shaking, but his eyes were clear. He destroyed everything, Aldous stammered, looking at the dead man. Our farm, our lives, all for a debt he invented. He was a monster. He looked at Sutton, his eyes filled with a deep, bottomless shame. I am so sorry, Sutton, for everything. Silence descended on the clearing, broken only by the sound of approaching horses. Lots of them. A posse of men rode into the clearing, led by the Junction City Sheriff. They took in the scene. The dead body of Cassian Blake, his two wounded men, the grim-faced group of survivors. We received a telegraph, the sheriff said, his eyes landing on Sutton. Told a pretty incredible story. Looks like it was all true. It was over. Really, truly over. Sutton dropped the poker and ran to Stellan, collapsing by his side, her strength finally giving out. He wrapped his good arm around her, holding her tight. Life didn't become a fairy tale after that, but it became real. The U.S. Marshals descended on Hollow Creek, and with Sutton's testimony and Lily's letters, they unraveled Cassian Blake's entire criminal empire. The town's sheriff was arrested. Aldous, for his role in the final moments, was given a lighter sentence. He and Aunt Marlowe left town the day he was released, disappearing into the pages of history. Hollow Creek began to heal. The women who had stood up in the town hall, led by Blythe and Marlowe Jane, became the new center of the community. They started a school. They organized a town council. They rebuilt their world without the shadow of a tyrant hanging over them. Sutton stayed. She and Stellan rebuilt his cabin, making it stronger, bigger, with more windows to let in the light. The land that had been stolen from her parents was returned to her. She wasn't an orphan girl with no dowry anymore. She was a landowner, a leader, a survivor. Months passed. The seasons turned. One evening, as they sat on their new porch, watching the sunset paint the sky, Stellan took her hand. His was calloused and strong. Hers was no longer the pale, delicate hand of a girl waiting to be sold. It was strong, too. Capable. I never asked you to stay, he said quietly. She smiled, leaning her head on his shoulder, which had long since healed into a faint scar. You didn't have to. Years later, people would still talk about the runaway bride who brought down the king of Hollow Creek. They'd say it was the day their town was reborn. But Sutton didn't care about the stories. She cared about the solid feel of the porch beneath her feet, the warmth of Stellan's hand in hers, and the quiet, steady rhythm of a life she had chosen, a life she had fought for, a life she had won. She wasn't the girl who was pushed from a wagon. She was the woman who had stood up, fought back, and in doing so, had shown an entire town how to be free. If you are on the edge of your seat through Sutton's incredible journey, and you believe in the power of one person to change the world, then do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of impossible odds and unbreakable spirits. Let me know in the comments. What was the moment you knew Sutton was going to win? Thanks for watching.